This is Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative.
All right, so we have something special on the podcast today, which is a panel with some of the journalists who work out of Queen's Park. They get to watch what the politicians are doing all day long and ask them really important questions on our behalf as citizens. Before we get started, I want each of them to introduce themselves so you can get familiar with them. You've probably followed their journalism online, whether on television and print or on the internet. Perhaps we will start with Colin, since he has been here in the past. Colin, take it away.
Hi, I'm Colin D'Mello. I'm the Queen's Park Bureau Chief at Global News, and I'm also the president of the Queen's Park Press Gallery.
Michael McGrath. I'm host of the onpoli podcast with Steve Paikin and myself, of course. And I also write for the website here at TVO, your provincial public broadcaster. And I've been here for, a decade plus now. It goes quickly.
It sure does.
And Jessica, do you want to round us out?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Jessica Smith-Cross. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Trillium. I've also been at Queen's Park for about 10 years.
Excellent. So as our listeners can tell, we have a lot of experience in the room, the virtual room here today. So I think this should be pretty excellent conversation. We're going to talk about what's gone on at Queen's Park, partly since the last election, but also since this session took place. It was an abrupt session, just about 30 days, of course. So, a lot of stuff has happened over that period of time. The first question I want to start off with is, what was the big story over this spring in Ontario politics? So the spring legislature, again, it started up basically a year after the last election. The PCs have their third straight majority, which means they can pretty much do what they want in the legislature in terms of passing legislation. But from your perspectives, what has been the biggest story in Ontario politics since voters have had that chance to weigh in? Perhaps we'll start with Jessica.
I think the biggest story has definitely been the private jet story. It's the one nobody saw coming until there it was, and then it exploded, and it was all everyone was talking about and thinking about. And it seems to be the one that makes a difference to regular people who don't follow politics as closely as we all do. So this was the story that I'm sure everybody knows, but I'll give it a go anyways. The Premier's office let it be known that they bought a private jet for the use of the Premier initially, is what they said, though that was later expanded to other cabinet and potentially for use in emergencies in some capacity. The blowback was swift. And then the Premier announced he was returning the jet, and then he did return the jet. There have been some costs associated with the buying and returning of the jet, some $200,000 or so. But I think what's made it this long and enduring story is that the Premier keeps talking about the jet very wistfully. He does seem to regret the way it happened, and it does seem to regret the fact that it has been returned. And so this whole saga of, should it have been bought? What did it mean that he did buy it? Now how we're spending more time thinking about, how does the Premier get around? He used to fly commercial more, and now he flies private. And all of this stuff we never used to talk about is now big and front and center in the news in Ontario these days.
John, do you agree that's the biggest story so far?
Yeah, I think I would have to say, that's number one by a very, very large increment. The number two that I think, it surprised me how much play it got outside of Queen's Park, in the sense of, I think there's a tendency for people to, at least I tend to think a lot of these stories do not necessarily make it into public consciousness as much as we try. But one that I think spread further than I expected it to was the changes to the Freedom of Information Act. The government substantially restricted the accessibility of public documents through the Freedom of Information process. And maybe I won't say too much more about it, because it's really Colin and Jessica both have substantially more important roles in that story than I do. But I will simply say that I was very surprised, and very pleasantly surprised, I want to say, at I don't want to do the stereotypical, I was in a cab and the cab driver started talking to me about that, but just out in the world talking to people, the freedom of information story did seem to percolate more than I expected.
And Colin, I know that you have on your cell phone, like you can see the metrics for all the stories that you put out. Were those the two big ones, or was there anything else that sort of saturated?
Yeah, I mean, like, the jet issue, to Jessica's point, it cut through a lot of the political noise in a way that no other story ever has, right? I mean, and people keep arguing with me about this in terms of, well, what about Mark Carney and how much money he spent on meals for his flights? And I have to keep reminding people, the story about the jet isn't a comparison of Doug Ford versus another politician. The story about the jet is Doug Ford versus himself. Right. This was the premier who in 2018 said that he was going to respect the taxpayer's dollar, that he was going to, save 4 cents of every dollar spent in the Ontario budget. He's going to balance the books, and how everyone else before him was a crook who was, cooking the books. And he was the one who always boasted about never once spending a dime on himself of taxpayer dollars. I believe the thing he always keeps saying, too, is the worst place you can send your money is to government, right? And so now we can see that ever since 2025, there's been a change in how the premier views himself, views the position, views how the chief executive of the province should be operating and behaving. And I think that's why the jet story really kind of stands out. Now, I mean, if you want to take a look at the other side, there's a good news story that came out of this session of the legislature as well. And that's the HST cut for all home buyers, right? I mean, that is, when you're talking about affordability, which is what a lot of people turn to government to actually look for, this is a major affordability measure, $1.4 billion to give everyone access to, about $130,000 in terms of a discount if you're buying a home that's up to $1 million. So that is, I think, also legitimately for this government, a pretty big news story, because it seems like it's moving the market a little bit. It's moving the needle on actually getting homes built in this province. You also have to take into account the fact that since 2022, the government has had successive pieces of legislation that have not worked and possibly made the housing market even worse. But you take the good, with the bad. I think with the HST cut, the fallout could be there, because I know the finance minister wasn't tremendously thrilled with having to spend all of that amount of money. And so that could have some kind of a knock-on effect later on. But, the jet definitely was a story both inside, outside Queen's Park, and up in the skies above it as well.
Point that I think Jessica was making, we're paying more attention to how the premier travels, but also, like, the premier keeps talking about this, and yet, like, yes, we keep asking him about it, it keeps coming up, but even just last week, the premier was saying, what was the line, that leaders across North America think it's a joke that he doesn't have his own private plane, and it really seems to have gotten under his skin, this sense that he wanted this thing, and he was told he could not have it, and it is just like, in a way that I don't think I mean, if I thought about it maybe a bit more, I could think of another example, but I have a hard time thinking of another example of the last 8 years where the government had to retreat on something and it like burned the premier up so much. Like, I can't think of something else quite like this.
One of the things that makes him such a good politician is he emotes publicly when he speaks. You can see how he's feeling about whatever issue. So if he's upset about something that other people are upset about it, you feel it too, and you connect with him, and it's a really powerful political ability. But when you see him apparently emoting about the loss of this private jet, it also comes through, I think, more clearly than is beneficial to him.
But I think it also raises a larger question, right? I mean, who in this government is responsible for looking after Doug Ford's brand, right? Who is the person who's going to be so protective, bare their teeth and say, no, that's going to put him at odds with his own brand? And like, we're not talking about, like, Kathleen Wynne didn't really have a brand in the way that Doug Ford has a brand, right? Dalton McGuinty had a brand, sure, but like, you have to go back to Mike Harris to see somebody who was so linked in the public's mind to this brand. And for Doug Ford, the brand is who he is. People don't necessarily elect the progressive conservatives. They elect Doug Ford, right? He really is the driver. And so, I mean, Ivana Yelich is now back in the premier's office, and she seems to be that person who's looking after the Ford brand. But it seems like while she was away, there was a massive gap there, and nobody was there to say, hey guys, I think maybe this might be seen as a complete betrayal of what we sold people back in 2018. And I think that to me is the most surprising part of it, is that there was a complete lapse in judgment to buy that jet, that nobody looked at it and said, this is going to do such deep injury to what we stand for as a brand, that's why we shouldn't do it. Nobody said it, so they went ahead with it.
Yeah, and I, because I'm the political one on this episode, I have to point out that Corey Tenike has not been around during this period, right? Like, I'm sure he's advising from afar, but he's been working on a BC Conservative campaign during this pretty much entire period. So I think that might play into it as well. John, you did mention the freedom of information issue, and I want to bring that up because I think that, less so than the jet, but that has been a huge flashpoint as well for a lot of people. So, I worked on the last version of the legislation on that back in 2014, and I've worked with a lot of people from the Peterson administration who, of course, brought in the legislation in the first place. It's been there for 40 years, largely untouched by people of all political stripes. They've seen the value of it, but perhaps more, they've seen the risk of doing anything to upset the apple cart on that. Ford has largely gutted this oversight tool, and he likes to talk about how other jurisdictions have the exact same rules. We know that's not true. That's what your reporting has shown. We also know that it's inspiring some changes at the federal level that are perhaps not what some Liberals who voted for Mark Carney would have expected necessarily. What I want to know, though, and Colin, I know your colleague Isaac has been tracking this in some threads and stuff about how many stories have been impacted by these changes, because there's a lot of research that you have submitted collectively, FOI requests on, that you were perhaps going to get some progress on that were killed by this legislation. So I'm interested in how many stories that are of public value have hit a dead end because of this. Jessica, I know you're deeply involved in this, so perhaps we can start with you.
Sure. I had one that was killed and then resurrected. So that was a fun saga for me personally. It's a big FOI request that had been going on for years about greenbelt requests, and it was initially denied under the legal changes. But then the government reconsidered. After they passed it, they took a break from actually responding to FOI requests and put out some guidance to civil servants. And I got those records in the end, and I'm still going through them. There's some pretty interesting look back at who was meeting who, with everyone who was involved in the whole opening up of the greenbelt, both on the developer and lobbyist side. And the staff side. But my broader team has been refused a number of things under the new legislation. So there was, Jack had one about a meeting with a bidder for the Ontario Place project, and who was at that meeting trying to figure out what other ways the province could have gone with the other suggestions at the time. We have a series of other requests about calendars of the Premier. We have Charlie Pinkerton has tracked the Premier's calendars for years, just to find out where he's going, because he doesn't release them. And that's how we did this recent story on the jet. We knew how he traveled because it was marked in the 8 years of calendars that Charlie had diligently FOI'd and maintained, and that's doesn't appear to be an option going forward either. So sometimes it's the small things, but the things that are getting denied are the heart of the political things. We still have access to civil servants' records. It's the stuff from the ministers and premiers' offices themselves that are now out of bounds.
Colin?
In between the time that the government passed the FOI laws and all of the effects of them came into focus, it appears that nobody knew exactly how to interpret and how to actually apply these laws. And it seems like, whether it was the civil service, whether it was the FOI coordinators or whatnot, came down with a blanket denial of everything, right? And part of our strategy at Global was to highlight all of these. I mean, I had conversations with my gallery colleagues as well, right? This gives us what a great story to kind of just keep saying, hey, look at this one got denied. Look at this one got denied. And then the story became about the request and, the wording of the request and how, and I think the point of that was to highlight to the government how big of an issue that this is going to be. I've never seen the government do something that takes an innocuous tool like the Freedom of Information Act and elevate it to a public discourse level. Nobody knows what the FOI law is. I mean, every time we did a story previous to this about a Freedom of Information Act, you would have to like include a line in there that said, the Freedom of Information Act, allows you to do this and that. You have to explain it to people. Now, two things about the FOI. One, people understand, at least, at the surface level, what the Freedom of Information Act is, what it represents, why it allows us to be able to get information from the government. But then they also very quickly hop to the Premier's cell phone. And I think that's one of the most interesting aspects of this, because people, I do believe Twitter has made all of us conspiracy theorists. And I think, the conspiracy theories about it, people are much more willing to believe, right? Because why would a politician go to this length to hide something that's on their personal cell phone? If they don't have the answer, at least they have the question, what might the Premier be hiding? And I think by taking this action, it's kind of like the Streisand effect. I mean, the Premier really has brought so much more attention to what might be on a cell phone. I think the opposition has also done a great job of it. But, they've really elevated the idea of freedom of information, accessing government records, and hiding government records to a public discourse. When you take that and the jet together, I think those two things have kind of combined for a lot of people to say, who is Doug Ford? Where is the penny pinching, most transparent premier in Ontario's history? Where has that person gone?
John, you follow a lot of this conversation online. I think you are a little terminally online like I am as well. What are your thoughts? What is your take been on this so far?
Well, the one that I keep coming back to, and I've said this in print and on the podcast as well, is that the Progressive Conservative Caucus, they all voted for these changes, and they have thus given their endorsement to these changes. And at a certain basic level, they don't know what secrets they've been told to keep, right? We already saw last week, I believe our colleagues at Global broke the story about Will Boma, the caucus chair, being stripped of his role in some of the aftermath of the private jet fiasco. And I think they are setting themselves up for more unpleasant events like this, right? Just because you've changed the Freedom of Information law doesn't mean the secrets are going to be kept. Doesn't mean that journalists stop doing our job. That people stop talking to us. Secrets will find their way out, even if the law is changed. And when that happens, the Progressive Conservative Caucus is still going to have to answer, or try to force an answer out of the Premier's office. And I just think that there's a real lack of foresight, I guess, on the part of some of these politicians, in the sense of they are going to continue to have these problems. They are going to keep cropping up, and they just don't seem to have a good answer or any kind of anticipation of that.
Again, as a political person, it's startling to me that the lack of foresight, because it seems pretty obvious that the more you try and control things, the less control you're going to have over it. I, of course, was in the Liberal Party. I was at the Liberal Party headquarters when the gas plant scandal was happening, and I can tell you as an inside person how much better that would have gone if they had just handed over information and had just left it at that. I do want to talk about, Colin, you were talking about the Premier's brand and why the jet story has been so problematic for him. And, he obviously came to power with this whole fiscal responsibility narrative. And at the same time, he has balanced exactly one budget. And Ontario's debt has now increased by 44% just over his 8 years in power. So the narrative there doesn't really jive with the record. And yet there has been far more outrage about this private jet than about the state of Ontario's finances. You can talk about the pandemic, you can talk about the trade war. Those obviously play into the conversation. But I think there's just, I don't know if it's the scale of the issue that is maybe, Ontarians miss when they're thinking about these things. Why was the jet such a bigger flashpoint than the state of Ontario's finances?
Well, first of all, I'll just say that when they did balance the budget, it was by accident. It was because they had a windfall I believe it was interest revenue or
I think you're
inflation
right.
revenue, and they totally balanced by accident. So, um, what are we if not pedantic on this podcast, huh? Come on. Look, I mean, I think. Like I said, right? I think you can kind of look at Doug Ford in almost three chapters, but you can look at it before the 2025 election and after the 2025 election. And I think his penchant for private travel really speaks to who he is becoming, and it's a departure from who he was, right? In 2018, he came in as really an inexperienced politician who thought that he can run the province like a business, and very quickly realized that you actually can't do that, because at the end of the day, the province, every money you spend goes to people. And once you start cutting that money back, people are going to let you know about it, right? So they had to strike that balance. I mean, he was bombastic, bull in a china shop, but at the heart of it, he was in touch with what that core constituency was, which was everyday people. Every single cabinet minister was gifted a For the People plaque that they all had to put and display proudly on their desks as a central reminder of who they were, right? I'll remind everyone that in 2018, they even said that all caucus members would be bringing brown bag lunches to their caucus meetings. The only reason I say this is because the other day I watched with some shock when the door of the caucus meeting opened and I saw a carved watermelon. And if I could swear, it would be a carved effing watermelon. Because to me, I was like, that carved watermelon spoke volumes to me about who the progressive conservatives are now compared to who they were before. Now, they're okay with running deficits. $13.8 billion. I mean, Kathleen Wynne would have dreamed of running deficits that deep. The debt is about to hit $500 billion. The premier's office is bigger than what Kathleen Wynne's ever was. Now the premier is buying a private jet. He's flying private all the time. I mean, I think people are starting to see that there is an evolution in this premier, right? And I think a lot of that had to do with how he viewed himself at the dawn of Donald Trump. No longer was he just the guy looking after the things in the backyard. Now his responsibility is to look outwards. He's meeting with more CEOs and meeting with more, governors, and he's operating at a higher level. And I think that in his mind gives him access to a higher level of politics. But we're still here, man. We're still living, paycheck to paycheck in this province. Things have not improved. People are, going. Like, one of the predominant conversations I have with my friends is the cost of the grocery store. It's a great conversation to have. I played this game with my kids the other day, where we were going through the letter of the alphabet, and you had to just say things that were at the grocery store. And my daughter got stuck at the letter I. And then you know what she said? She said, increasing prices. That's what you find at the grocery store. She's 10, friends. She's 10. So, I think all that to say is that we are still grounded in this province. We are still living our lives, the way everyone was living their lives in 2018, right? And since 2020, it's become even more difficult. And I think when you see kind of the difference between how the premier, the For the People premier, is starting to operate, but nothing has kind of lifted for all of the boats that are down still, taking on water, it creates a differential, and it creates a, you're living here and we're living down here, right? And I think that may have been why it hurt people so much, because this is no longer the guy who they gave their vote to in 2018. And we're seeing that in the polls. People are looking for other places to, even if park their vote permanently or temporarily, they're looking somewhere else. And once you lose that core constituency, it's hard to get them back.
John, are you seeing that kind of reaction online? Like, when I look at, to me, it's what Colin's saying. It's, people are really, really hurting, and then you see this grandiose expenditure that doesn't seem necessary, and that seems to hurt them more than the lack of help for the things that people are struggling with. Do you get that sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And, to reiterate a point that Colin was making, the premier talks about like he's being held to a double standard, the media is holding him to a double standard. I will just say, like, nobody cares about the standards that reporters hold politicians to. What they actually care about is the standards that politicians hold themselves to. And, you know, Doug Ford 2018 would have absolutely torn a strip off of Doug Ford of 2026. This is just very, very clear. And yeah, I think that is going to be a problem for the premier going forward. If I can speak to the terminally online for a moment, I think one of the other interesting things is the very slow, and I don't even want to overstate the significance of it, but I do think it's interesting, the erosion of support within the conservative movement for Doug Ford. We've spoken on our podcast with Chris Spoke, Matthew Spoke, I think, the Spoke brothers, who are working with Project Ontario, and they are basically dissident conservatives who are trying to make the argument for a post-Doug Ford or a non-Doug Ford conservative movement here in Ontario. And, I don't think that Doug Ford is in any imminent risk of a collapse of support within his party, but it's the kind of thing you only see happen when it's not just that people are disappointed with the current state of conservative leadership, but they're also not afraid to say it out loud, right? Like in 2019, you would not have seen anybody say that they were going to make the alternative argument for somebody other than Doug Ford. Doug Ford was the unquestioned champion of conservative politics, and nobody would have dreamt of challenging him. But it's 8 years later, and there is a strain of conservative in Ontario who, frankly, are really disappointed. Like, some of the stuff we've already talked about, right? Government has gotten larger, the spending has gotten larger. If you were the kind of person who wanted to see a progressive conservative government make really aggressive reforms to things like education or more private healthcare delivery. There has been some of that stuff. There have been some reforms to education, but nothing like what the really aggressive conservative vision might have called for. And so, yeah, people are at least, there is a strain of conservative in this province who is impatient, and they are increasingly trying to make the argument for other voices as well.
Jessica, I want to ask you a similar question, because when I think of the Trillium's reporting, perhaps more than any other outlet, I think you really cover the gap between Doug Ford and what he says to the camera and Doug Ford and what he does behind the scenes. And the jet issue, I think that was pretty much as salient as anything since the Greenbelt. And you guys spent a lot of time covering the Greenbelt. And of course, that started with some comments that he made behind the scenes. And then, he's gone back and forth. And there was a whole bunch to that story that you've uncovered. Do you think that this is something that's going to be a problem for him going forward, or will he rebound like he did after the Greenbelt?
I think there's a through thread in some of this stuff. So you go back to the Greenbelt, and then there was two problematic aspects for it. You had that meeting that you referred to where he told this group of developers he was going to open it up. And then he was like, he got caught. It's like, oh, no, okay, I'm not going to do it. And he goes forwards and he does it. And then everybody collectively in the media discovered that, there were these pretty close connections between the developers who were going to benefit from the opening up and then having donated to the party and then having gone to his daughter's wedding. Colin, you did the Stag and Doe story. These were some of them were people or lobbyists or related to the people who were there giving money to the premier's family on the, to celebrate the wedding. And it had that really problematic aspect of benefiting in a personal way from something that was being done on a policy level. And some of the through thread to the reporting that we've done since, if you look at the Skills Development Fund, we've spent a lot of time tracing government money given to groups that were benefiting the government party, politically, or even had personal ties to some of its members. And that's where it gets not great, to be frank. And I think people are aware of this. People have been building awareness of this aspect, this kind of problematic aspect to the way government decisions are made since the Greenbelt, building through the Skills Development Fund. And when you get to the private jet, it's not quite the same, but there's this sort of, it echoes, right? He's made a decision that's not very popular, but that was going to make his life easier with our money. And I think people see that and they don't like it.
So I want to talk about the opposition, because of course, part of why Doug Ford has had such strength as a premier is that he's had a weak and divided opposition. So, I was looking back at the numbers, and the NDP, their support has actually gone down in terms of seats every election since Doug Ford's been elected, which is not what you would expect necessarily as a premier becomes unpopular or has been in power for a long time. The Liberals, their big victory is getting caucus status. And again, that's not a really big achievement in the grand scheme of things. And then, of course, the Greens only have 2 seats as well. So this is not a very strong opposition. I know they try to do things, but again, they have not been a big force against Doug Ford. Again, you can talk about the pandemic, you can talk about the trade war as being distractions and preventing them from breaking through. But at the end of the day, they have not attracted the attention that they perhaps would like to get from voters to change, the political calculus in this province at this point. John, maybe we can start with you. Why do you think the opposition has failed to break through, onto the front pages, but also with the electorate?
A few different things I would mention. One is just, we've talked about Ford's personality, his brand. He really is a big personality, and he tends to suck up the oxygen for the news cycle on any given day. And it is genuinely difficult to compete with that. You kind of have to be a big personality to compete with that. And all due respect to the different leaders who have tried to challenge him, I don't think anybody has been able to match him in terms of certainly the ability to get attention. Marit Stiles is changing some things up. She's really adopted more of a Zoran Mamdani sort of online video strategy. Does not seem to be paying huge dividends yet, but it bears paying attention to over the next little while. But the other thing I would just say, just as a baseline for all opposition parties at Queen's Park, is that they really are structurally weaker in what they are able to do than what even the opposition is able to do federally. They just do not have the same powers and privileges under the standing orders that opposition parties on Parliament Hill can bring to bear. Even like opposition motions are just incredibly weak. And so, you've got a bunch of structural factors making it very, very difficult to break through. I don't think it's impossible, but I do think it's difficult, and that explains part of why Ford has benefited so much from having that divided opposition.
Well, Jessica, do you think the Ford sort of fill the window strategy makes it next to impossible, or is this something that voters tend not to pay attention between writs, but as soon as the election comes, they might pay attention. If you stand out right in that moment, maybe the opposition has a chance. What do you think it is?
I think that yes, Ford is absolutely compelling. You turn a camera on, you want to watch. He grabs the oxygen. Yes, and the leaders that have been up against him have not been at all. We had Stephen Del Duca representing the Liberal Party. He wasn't a compelling person to listen to or watch. It sounds cruel to say out loud, but it's not. When you're talking about politics, especially through the media and not one-on-one, some people sort of have it and some people don't. And Stephen Del Duca and Bonnie Crombie did not, right? Bonnie Crombie, to speak to one-on-one, is an incredibly charming and interesting person. I found when we would turn the cameras on to her and ask a question, it was not. And it's not maybe why we should pick people to run a big province like Ontario. Perhaps there should be other skills we value. But the question you're asking about is how do you break through and get people's attention? And you got to be better at that than those leaders were. John referred to Marit Stiles trying to up her game there. I think she has an even steeper hill to climb than the next potential Liberal leader on that front, because people are naturally inclined in Ontario, given the electoral history, to look to the Liberals first if they're looking to somebody to defeat a Conservative government.
Colin?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of an indictment, I think, on the NDP that, Marit Stiles has been the leader of the official opposition since, 2023, and people still, she's not a household name. Now to John and Jessica's point, I mean, if you go into an elementary school and ask them who Doug Ford is, they'd be able to point him out, on a list of politicians, right? So he definitely has a lot of name recognition. He definitely is in people's living rooms all the time because there is no topic that the premier won't comment on. And, when he does comment on them, he's able to, strike lightning often more than once in a news conference. But that being said, though, I mean, the official opposition, I always struggle with the idea with the NDP about what their primary objective should be here, because, whenever the legislature is not sitting, Marit Stiles is very quick to go to whatever community she can possibly hit into where the NDP might, have either come in first or second in the last election because they're looking to build a lot of ground support. She's not shy and she's not lazy. She will do the hard work and go to every single riding that she possibly can. There's a big focus right now on the Northern Ontario ridings, and she's hitting a lot of those ridings. I think the NDP has, there's that versus speaking to the gallery. There's almost less of an impact that they make with the Queen's Park Press Gallery, the NDP, I find. And it always kind of leaves me scratching my head, but right? Because to us, our megaphone goes right across the province, right? We do a story and it could be potentially read from, Windsor to Ottawa, right? You take CTV as an example, which has a presence in Windsor, Ottawa, and Northern Ontario. Global is a little bit more restricted. Others, CBCs everywhere. But their inability to kind of always interface with us, especially during the summer periods where there isn't a lot of news happening all the time, and the NDP could take advantage of those moments. Instead, they wait for when the House is sitting to make as much noise as possible, and then they go quiet in between. And I never understand what is behind that strategy. I do think on a couple of issues, the NDP in particular is making a lot of noise, and it's starting to impact the government in a way that they're paying attention and wanting to respond to them. One of them is Northern Ontario highways. I know that the premier, from what I've heard, is looking at that as an issue that they're putting a little bit more attention on, defending themselves a little bit more, and that's because the NDP has elevated that conversation. So they've done a good job there. The recent legislation that they tried to pass on removing the HST from prepared foods at the grocery store, I thought that was really smart. It was a very It almost harkened back to Doug Ford 2018, right? Which is find this very niche thing that government could solve by, it's a hit to the treasury, but at the end of the day, it gives some small tax relief to people at home. And you couple that with what John said, this more, Zoran Mamdani style video, which the NDP has thankfully moved away from these weird, crazy cat videos, and they've moved to these new, like, incredibly well-produced videos. I think Pierre Poilievre was really the one who started these kind of short-form documentary videos in Canada, and more politicians are doing them. Doug Ford's doing them, and Marit Stiles is. And, if you're terminally online, like we all are, and I believe the next generation of voters in 2029, 2030 will be this big block of terminally online people who respond to this kind of respond to these types of videos. I think they can strike really well. When it comes to the Ontario Liberals, all of the above that my colleague said. We'll see what happens after the next leader is selected, whether, it might not necessarily be that the province is looking for the right Liberal leader. They're just going to be at the next election tired of the government, which, could be in charge for 15 years or so. And we all know how terrible it is for a government to be in charge for 15 years, right? As the as the PCs like to say. So for the Liberals, I just think time is their best friend in this regard. And we'll see what happens when they elect the next leader.
Well, that actually ties quite nicely into my next question, which is about the state of the polls right now. So I can't remember. I've been looking back the other day, and I think Ford had last been in second place in the polls in like January 2021 or 22, something like that. It was a very, very long time ago. He's dominated the polls since then. And at no point has he fallen into second. It's now, hit or miss. where he is, whether he's first or second, and we're seeing some changes with that as we get away from the jet a bit, and then he brings it back up, all that kind of stuff. But mostly within the margin of error at this point, which doesn't really mean anything, as we could be not having an election for an extremely long time from now. Having said that, though, he's been in power for 8 years, and my position on this has always been, watching enough governments as I have, and having been in some of them as well, that governments usually get about 8 to 10 years. And then voters, regardless of how they actually feel about that government and the things they have done, they get rid of them because they're just sick of them and they want something new. Like, it's not even, in my opinion, about whether they're serving them well or not. They just want something different. Do you guys think this is a midterm slump, or is this something that is, are the polls showing the signs of fatigue with this government? Is this something that might lead to a replacement of this government at some point? Maybe Jessica, you can start.
I think that what you're seeing is time, the barnacles of government, that everything sort of piles up. People get whatever it is that motivates them that hasn't gotten better or has gotten worse. It adds up on a government, like you were saying. When you look at the polls, you'll see that people still say their vote intention is generally towards the progressive conservatives, but asked, if it's time for a new government, or ask how they're doing on any particular file, that kind of polling is quite weak. I think what that says is there is an opening for an alternative, but there has to be an alternative. And so that's back to our conversation about who's going to be that alternative, what's it going to look like, and that presumably we'll have a couple of different visions of that by the time we get to another election. But it does feel on a base political level that this could be end stages.
What do you think about that? Because, when I think about this government, people always say Doug Ford is Teflon, so maybe he gets away with this because he does seem to want to stay as leader for a long time. Usually this is also the point where a leader maybe sees that they should move on. But what I've noticed since Mark Carney became leader is the permission structure that people had to ignore the inaction of this PC government has basically gone out the window because Justin Trudeau isn't there to blame anymore. And, Mark Carney's the newer guy, so people aren't as inclined to blame him. They're going to look back towards Ford. Are you seeing that as well?
Yeah, I think that if I could put a bit of a finer point on it, I think, it's not just the generic passage of time. I think, though there's some of that, right? It's that after enough time in government, the problems that crop up, because you exist in government, when they crop up on day one of your government, by definition, the problem is the fault of the guy who came before you, right? And then by year 8, more and more often, the cause of the problem that some voter is raising, that you're making their life harder for some reason, it turns out the cause is actually something you did in year 1 or year 2, right? And, we're going to start seeing, even just if you want to talk about like the persistent deficits that this government is looking forward to for the next has spent and will continue to spend more than it generates in revenue. A lot of that is because of these. It's not like there's one single massive tax giveaway that you can point to, but there have been a series of, whether it's the getting rid of the license fees, whether it's cutting the gas tax, whether it's the HST break on homes that Colin mentioned earlier. Some of these are objectively large, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, pretty soon it's real money. But collectively is where you really start to see the problems for the provincial treasury. And I guess I would also just add, you mentioned Justin Trudeau departing, and I would say the other thing that was salient, not just was Justin Trudeau's personal unpopularity by the end, but for several years, Doug Ford. I want to be careful how I say this because obviously governing during the pandemic was not in fact governing on easy mode, but from the fiscal perspective, the pandemic made a fire hose of federal money available to the provincial government. And, we actually saw, provincial revenues increase during a time of massive recession, which is, what that first year of the pandemic was, totally unprecedented in the province's history to have that weird fiscal dynamic. And that federal money continued to come for several years after under Justin Trudeau. And so now you've got this situation where the federal money is slowing down, and the provincial economy is also struggling with tariff revenue or tariff impacts rather. So all of the forces that were making it relatively easy to make lots of people happy. Oh, sure, here we'll give you a tax cut on gasoline. Oh, here we'll cut the fees here. None of those choices are easy anymore. And so you've got the expenditure, just the passage of time, these daily problems that crop up, and all of the solutions are going to be harder going forward.
Colin, John mentioned the blame game that governments play. And, in the first few years, they go, oh, well, that was the previous government's fault. We're here to fix that, et cetera, et cetera. I have noticed that most governments do not jettison that argument no matter how long they have stayed in government. You hear Doug Ford still blaming Liberals for things. And, a government of his duration, even after 8 years, even if they can't say, oh, this was the Liberals' fault, they can say, well, we're doing a better job than them. You can't possibly want to go back to them. Is part of the drop in the polls people just no longer believing that key message?
I think the drop of the polls, from my perspective, I think a lot of it has to do with the longevity of the government, and not necessarily seeing their own situation or scenario, improve vastly, right? At the end of the day, the government is extremely good at being able to toss off any of the criticism that comes its way, and either send it off to the former Liberal government, or when Trudeau was there, he was such an easy, convenient punching bag for them. I have noticed they have tried it with the Carney government, but they haven't gone so far as to say Mark Carney's to blame. It's like, well, the feds are, and they can't even almost bring themselves to complete the sentence, because they know that, I don't think that under Mark Carney, they're going to get the same kind of easy, I'll take everything treatment that Justin Trudeau seemed to give them. I think the next few years really are going to be marked for Doug Ford by this duel in the polls, right? I think they're going to be up and down and up and down. His brand is remarkably strong. He is remarkably strong. And sometimes, he always has this penchant for being able to say the right thing at the right time, capture the mood at the moment. And people are, I don't want to say easily swayed, but people like that they hear their politician reflect back how they're feeling, right? I use a couple of weather vanes in my own life, and my wife is one of them. She's a healthcare worker who, during the pandemic, would always be so frustrated with the government. The zenith of her anger, I think, was when one day she came home. I was working from home at the time, and I told her, I said, hey, there's a plan to start reusing and recycling masks. And I think she almost lost her mind, right? Because that's how bad the scenario was during those first early days of the pandemic. But then she'll always say to me, at least he's willing to apologize. And I think that people underestimate just how much that ends up resonating with people. And that's why Doug Ford gets so many chances from people. To take it back to Rob Ford's days, as we've been talking about, Doug Ford's brand, right? There was this interesting conversation, I remember, during Rob Ford's days, during the height of the crack cocaine scandal, and people would say, well, how come Rob Ford gets away with it, but Dalton McGuinty gets held to a much higher standard than him? And the question and the answer to that was because Rob Ford never ran as the perfect person. He was never there as the person who was going to be the moral steward of the city. He was there to save you taxes, and that was it. And as long as it was the gravy train that he was solving, he was good, and people were willing to forgive the other stuff because they were saving money, right? If Dalton McGuinty did any of that stuff, no, he was premier dad. And so he couldn't be seen as kind of going against that brand. So for Doug Ford, he's not running as the perfect guy. It's okay if his shirt's a little untucked or he's a little disheveled. It's okay if he kind of pats his belly and makes a joke about his own weight, because people find him very endearing. I think for Doug Ford, the next few years are going to be marked by the question of, is the end going to come as a result of voter revolt at the next election? Is it going to come as a result of caucus revolt? Or is it going to come because he decided the time is right and he's going to hang up his hat and leave? And very few people get to retire in politics. Doug Ford might be one of those individuals who actually gets to retire in politics, because I don't see anybody in the current Progressive Conservative caucus looking at these polls and saying, now's the time to strike, right? The smartest thing Doug Ford did after the 2025 election, he was at the PDAC conference and we all asked him, was that going to be your last election? And he said, no, I'm going to be premier forever. He quashes all of the dissent that could be within his caucus, and there's nobody there to challenge him. So as of right now, people might be tired of him. People, they may be in government for a long time, but where is that challenge coming from? And that could be a positive thing for Doug Ford. It can also be a negative thing, because I bought in politics, challenge is what really makes you a better politician, because you got to respond to your critics. And he doesn't have any of that, which is why he went out and bought a jet.
Okay, just before we go here, I do want to talk about the summer. So obviously MPPs are heading back to their constituencies over the summer. It is, not a vacation as some people may think. They do go do work in their local ridings. But that means that the focus is going to pull away from Queen's Park, and sometimes your average voter perhaps stops paying attention to some of these stories. What do each of you think are going to be the main stories over the course of the summer that people should be following as we head back into the fall and another session? Let's go, John. We can start with you in a bit.
Well, I personally, the one I will be paying closer attention to will be some of the municipal races around the province. I live in Toronto. We work in Toronto. I will be paying attention to the Toronto mayoral race, but I will be trying to pay attention to cities elsewhere, Ottawa, Mississauga. There's an interesting challenge in Burlington to the sitting mayor there. Hamilton looks like it'll be fun. All of those races should be interesting. And then, of course, I believe that the Ontario Liberal Party will probably arrange something newsworthy to happen. So we'll see how that goes.
Jessica?
Yeah, the by-election or by-elections will be something to pay attention to. Parties do crazy things when they want to win a by-election, and so maybe they'll deliver something fun. It's also time for us to spend the time doing the work. When the summer hits, we have more time. Not every reporter is filing a story every day, like when the House is sitting. So you have time to go through documents, request for documents, dig. And when we started doing our skills development fund reporting, it was about a year ago, and it was months before the stories were out. But that time is so necessary to do the kind of work that comes up with what might be coming next.
Colin?
I think to just jump off on the Skills Development Fund, I mean, the big report from Ontario's Integrity Commissioner looking into David Piccini, I think that will be a big one. I'm looking also to see whether any cabinet ministers call it quits over the summer. Early June would have marked the provincial election had we not had the early election in 2025. So that brings to a neat conclusion 8 years in office. And if you're the type of person to think you only want to do 2 terms, this might be the time. So that'll be interesting. I want to see, what the premier does in terms of trying to reclaim that Captain Canada mantle and how he can kind of do that. I mean, he's attempting to do some of that now with a lot of trips to Washington. I also think that while the premier doesn't need to come back home with any wins, he can't afford to make a single mistake this summer. So, one will be kind of detrimental to him. And then, I mean, the Ontario Liberal leadership is going to give us lots of fodder, right? I mean, there are a lot of policy people in there, which is really interesting. The Navdeep Bains element of it, the Nate Erskine-Smith element of it. There will be lots of neat politics to happen over the course of the summer, and so I think that'll be the summer and the fall, I should say, friends. It'll be almost Halloween before we're all back in the Ontario legislature, so it'll be a long and grueling summer for us.
Shortest sitting in something like 50 years outside of election years.
Yeah, it could be shorter though, John. I think if they wanted it to be.
Yes, it could.
Shorter.
I was going to say in some of the eastern provinces they sit for 7 days, so let's hope we don't get that. Colin, you have given me an idea. Perhaps we will have a journalist panel on the Liberal race, because it is certainly going to be long, and I need content as well. So Stay tuned for that potentially. Thanks so much, all of you, for joining me today. I hope our listeners enjoyed this. And of course, my ask to our listeners is to continue following all these fantastic journalists, because they're doing incredible work with limited resources and, a lot of pushback that they get from government and voters alike. And yet they still keep doing excellent work, some of the best work, I think, in journalism across the country. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian-owned company specializing in strategic communications, narrative development, and content creation. Our music today was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.